About 40 years ago, I attended my first business conference in Kansas City. It was overwhelming, but I learned a lot and made many great career connections. Everything was fun until the time came for me to take the long drive home. I left a lot later than I'd planned, and by midnight I was still several hours away from home. There was nothing but cornfields and darkness around me, and the miles of highway blended together in a long, boring stretch of blacktop. I don't know what time of night it was, but I must have been zoning out because I was suddenly startled awake by a sight of something next to the road ahead. Not really thinking about it, I slammed on my brakes, blinking as my headlights slowly brought it into focus. A person, 3 people actually, standing next to the highway staring at me. All 3 of them wore long red robes that stretched down to the road, and their faces were covered with hoods. The color of the robes were odd. Wasn't red like normal clothing or even like a bright Halloween costume. The red of their robes was like the deep red of a dried bloodstain, as if someone had drenched them in blood before they got here. I brought the car to a halt just a few yards away and stared at them, wondering if my tired mind was hallucinating things. For a moment, nobody moved, but then the central figure slowly walked over to my driver's side window. Belatedly, I realized I had left it rolled down in the summer heat, and before I could get it rolled up, he leaned inside, cowled face inches from my own. "Your time has come. Get out of the car," he hissed in a high voice. I froze for a second, my panicking brain trying to figure out what to do, and then I stomped on the gas. With a squeal of tires, my car launched forward, and I veered past all 3 red-robed figures, trying to avoid hitting them. I shifted gears, racing along the dark highway faster and faster, my heart threatening to pound out of my chest. What had they been doing? Why were 3 strange people out here in the middle of Kansas? It made no sense. A few miles later, just as my heart rate was beginning to settle down, I rounded a bend in the highway and saw several more figures ahead of me. This time, they stood in the middle of the road, blocking my path. More people in red robes. I came to a halt, farther away from them this time, and tried to figure out what to do. None of them moved this time, but I was suddenly startled by a loud banging sound on the back of my car. I screamed and whirled around, and there were several more people behind my car, all in bloody red robes. One of them was hitting the trunk of my car with his fist, and several more were hurrying out of the cornfields behind him. I jumped the car forward, trying to get away, but in my panic and haste, I killed the car and it lurched to a halt. "Your time has come! Your time has come!" several voices shouted. Something smashed my rear window, and I screamed as I fumbled for the keys and tried to start the engine again. Groping hands grabbed my shoulder as I yanked away as I gunned the engine to life. With another lurch, the car jumped forward, pulling me away from the gripping hands and flailing fists. I careened down the highway, not caring if I hit anyone. Robe figures drove out of my way, and I shot through the center of the little gathering. I heard a few thumps behind me, and when I glanced in my rearview mirror, I saw that they were throwing rocks. The speedometer crept up higher, and I still accelerated, tearing along past endless cornfields. I was going 90 miles an hour, and I didn't care. I wanted to be as far away from those people as I could. 10 miles, then 20 miles. After 30 miles, I started to relax my breathing a little. What had even happened? Who had all these people been? My mind raced as I tried to piece it together. Was it some sort of cult? A weird fraternity initiation? If it had been a prank, it was a sick one, and I couldn't believe that people would risk getting run over just to smash someone's window for a joke. No matter what it had been, I wanted to just get home and put it all behind me. I eased off the gas, not wanting to run off the road. I almost reacted too slowly. A man in red robes suddenly leapt out of the cornfield ahead of me. I couldn't hear him over the racing wind through my broken windows, but he wasn't wearing his hood, and his face was twisted in a horrible snarl. With a leap, he tried to jump on top of my car. Somehow, I managed to yank the steering wheel just in time, and I barely missed him by a few inches. As I sped up again, gripping the steering wheel as tight as I could, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man stared after me, then slowly sank to his knees in the middle of the road and raised his face to the sky. As I went around a bend, it looked like he was screaming a cry of anguish. I've never seen someone look so distraught in all my life. I didn't slow down until I left that stretch of Kansas, and I didn't stop until I was safely home a few hours later. But even though I hadn't seen any more strange people after that, I didn't sleep the rest of that night, and I was on edge for days. I never did find out who they had been or why they were there, although I asked everyone I knew. But one thing was for certain. I was never driving down that lonely highway again. I live in a pretty small town, but last spring I drove a few hours to a nearby city for a concert. I had a blast, but it was quite late when I finally drove home, and I was exhausted. To make matters worse, during the night sometime it had started pouring rain. As I crept along the deserted highway through the rain, windshield wipers racing to try to give me a little bit of visibility, my eyes started getting heavy. I didn't want to fall asleep behind the wheel, so I considered just pulling over and sleeping in my truck until morning. It was an old crew cab pickup, rather cramped to sleep in, but I'd done it before. Just then, I saw something in the rain directly ahead of me. It took me a second to realize that it was a human, and I belatedly yanked the wheel to the side, narrowly avoiding hitting him. I skidded on the wet pavement for a few feet, but I quickly got the car under control and stopped. I looked behind me, and I could just make out a dark shape running along the highway toward my truck. I don't know why, but the way the figure moved felt odd, and all the hairs on my arms stood on end. But before I could do anything, he came up to the passenger door and opened it, sliding quickly into the passenger seat. I was too stunned to react for a moment. "Thank you for stopping your motor vehicle to aid me," he said haltingly, speaking each word as if it was its own separate entity. "The moisture in the air is severely unpleasant on my skin." I stared at the newcomer and licked my lips nervously. He wore a black t-shirt soaked to the skin, and his short brown hair clung wetly to his skull. But most strangely of all, he wore a pair of dark sunglasses, even though it was storming and in the middle of the night. The cab of the truck felt eerily quiet for a long moment, and the only sound was the rain rattling on the roof and the faint sound of my rumbling engine. Finally, I cleared my throat and spoke nervously. "This is some storm, isn't it?" "Yes, the storm is very great and powerful," the stranger intoned. "Even greater than I had foreseen." I shivered. This guy was super strange, but we were miles from any town, and I didn't want to leave him alone in the rain. My discomfort warred with my desire to help, and finally I decided to do the right thing. Sighing, I put the truck back in gear and continued down the road. "So where are you heading?" I asked. "There's nothing around for miles. You want me to drop you off somewhere?" The stranger was silent for a long time, and I thought he had fallen asleep, but then he slowly turned his head to look directly at me. I couldn't see his eyes under his sunglasses, but I squirmed uncomfortably under his hidden gaze. "I travel to where I will, the same destination as you." He sighed and leaned toward me, and I cringed away, pressing my body up against the cold window. "Take me where you go," he whispered harshly, and I almost swerved off the road. "No!" I shouted, and he snapped back. Clearly I was dealing with someone dangerous. I needed to find an excuse to stop and get him out the truck. "No," I said more calmly. "I'm sorry I don't have any room in my house, but I could drop you off at the next town. I'm sure they have a hotel." He sat back and didn't say anything, and my mind raced as I tried to keep an eye on him. Letting him in the truck had clearly been a mistake, but I didn't want to risk a physical confrontation. What if he had a weapon? Even without it, could he overpower me and take my truck, leaving me out in the storm? I didn't want to risk it until I reached the town. The next 20 minutes were the most agonizing minutes of my life, and sweat ran freely down my sides despite the cool temperature. The stranger didn't say anything, but he slowly began to breathe more loudly as we neared the town. Harsh, ragged breaths, slowly at first, but faster as the miles went by. In, out, in, out, in, out. His breath sounded hoarse, as if he had been shouting or running for miles. We reached the outskirts of town, and his breathing became actual panting, fogging up the windows. I realized he wasn't looking at me anymore, but was instead staring out the passenger window, his sunglasses only inches from the pane. His breathing got more and more animated, and I slowed down, thinking that this had to be my time to get rid of him. Just as I was pulling over, he let out a huge scream, explosively loud in that tiny cab. I swerved and ran over a curb, then jerked the wheel and brought the truck back on the road. He screamed again and pointed out his window. The storm, it's leaving me. It can't leave me. I love the rain. Bring back the storm." He collapsed in a ball, sobbing. You must take me on. I am not with them yet." I screeched to a halt, not caring that I was in the middle of the road, and jumped out of the truck. Running around to the other side, I yanked open the passenger door, then grabbed him by his shirt and hauled him out of the truck. He didn't resist, and I marched him to the sidewalk beside the road, where he promptly plopped down to the wet pavement, wailing as the rain slowly abated. I ran back to my truck, locking and slamming the passenger door before running around to my side and clambering in. I put it in gear and took off, but the rain had stopped, and in the relevant quiet I faintly heard a scream from behind me. "Take me to them! Please! I need to be with them!" I sped through the town, not looking back once, and continued on down the highway. It was only another hour back, and I just wanted to get home. But just outside the outskirts of my own town, I saw 3 people standing by the highway watching me approach. I started shivering uncontrollably when I saw that they, too, wore thick sunglasses, even though it was still the middle of the night. My own breathing started coming in gasps, and I knew I was close to a panic attack. All 3 of them turned slowly to watch me as I sped by, and one of them raised a hand in greeting, but I ignored them. I turned onto some side streets, twisting and turning for several minutes until I was sure I wasn't being followed, and then finally pulled into my driveway. It was just after 2 in the morning, but I was wide awake. I never saw the hitchhiker or those strange people again, and I hope I never will. But I can't help myself now. Every time I drive at night and see someone ahead of me, I start panicking, and I'm sure they're not wearing sunglasses. When I was a teenager, I had a rough family life. Whenever things got too bad at home, I'd sometimes get in my car and go for a long drive to clear my head. Late one night, I was arguing with my parents and needed to blow off steam, so I grabbed my keys and stormed out. For a while, I just drove around town aimlessly, not thinking about anything in particular at all. After an hour or so, I snapped out of my funk and started paying attention to my surroundings. I was downtown, driving slowly along a quiet side street. There were no other cars on the road, and all the businesses were shut down for the night. I didn't have a watch on me, but I think it must have been somewhere after midnight. I rolled down my window and breathed in the warm summer air. The road curved slowly around the edge of downtown, encompassing the heart of the old community. It took my time, and I soon found myself approaching what we called Church Row on the edge of town. In the early days, several churches had sprung up around the same time, and they'd all been built within a few blocks of each other. A few of them were still in use, but some of them had been shut down and turned into little historical places. Sometimes my friends and I would sneak into the abandoned church on the corner to have parties. As I drove by, I half expected to see lights through some of the broken windows, but there was nothing. I slowed the car down to a crawl, half tempted to check if anyone was there, then shook my head. I didn't want to talk with anyone right now. Suddenly, all the lights along the street winked out, plunging everything into darkness except the patch of street in front of my headlights. "What the heck?" I muttered as I peered up at one darkened light pole. Maybe the street had lost power. It was a little creepy suddenly having the only light around. I shrugged and decided to head home for the night. The first scream nearly made me jump out of my skin. I whirled around in my seat, looking about wildly. It was close by, close enough for me to hear through my open windows, and it sounded like a woman screaming in pain. Or in fear. Was one of my friends pranking me? Nothing happened for several moments, and I eventually decided it had just been a fluke, or someone had been trying to play a joke. I kept driving, when a moment later, I heard another scream, closer this time, off to my right. I was so startled, I yanked the wheel and swerved all over the road. Once I corrected course, I decided I didn't want to be part of whatever this was. I needed to find a way back home. I sped up, but there were more screams outside my windows, some far away, some close by. The streets all around were still dark, and I couldn't see a thing beyond my pale headlights. I sped up and rounded a corner. The rest of the city opened up before me, but in an instant all the lights suddenly winked out across the whole city. I slammed on my brakes instinctively, breathing heavily. What was going on? Someone screamed right next to my window, and I took off, not even looking behind me to see who it was. I careened around corners, barely keeping my car in control, trying desperately to get out of this old district of downtown. I whipped left and right, but all around me, every city block was shrouded in darkness, and I quickly got turned around. I was panting as I sped around another corner, and I suddenly pulled up short. I had reached a dead end. I knew exactly where I was, and it was the last place I wanted to be at the moment. My headlights reflected dully off the gray metal gates of the old Methodist cemetery, and I knew I had just traveled in a circle. Panicking in the dark must have turned me around more than I thought. I was right behind the church row, at the entrance to the enormous old cemetery that stretched beyond all the churches. Panting, I started to put my car in reverse and turn around, and there was another scream outside. At the same time, a light suddenly flared for a moment, and I froze. It wasn't a street light, but the sudden brightness of firelight, and it was coming from atop a hill in the cemetery. I stared at the flames for a moment and realized it was some sort of big bonfire that had suddenly been lit. And then I saw people. All I could see were shadows, but a dozen or so people were dancing around the fire, madly running around in circles and jumping up and down. I could vaguely hear their whoops and hollers, and I started to relax again. Some folks must have been having a party in the cemetery, and the shouts must have just been them letting out some energy. I hesitated, then decided to leave before the cops showed up. I started to turn the car around when suddenly I saw her. She was up on my hill, standing behind the bonfire. The light reflected off her white dress and pale face, and even though she looked about my age, I knew I'd never seen her at the high school before. She stared down at me, past the flames, and the look on her face will haunt me the rest of my life. Screams rose up on all sides of me, and suddenly dozens of people dressed in white were racing past my car, screaming their lungs out. The bonfire blazed higher, and I looked at the girl again standing behind the flames. She spread her arms wide, and I realized that her white dress was stained red with blood. She cried aloud, a terrible, quavering sound, and before I even knew what I was doing, I was racing back down the street, my heart pounding frantically in my chest, and I began hyperventilating as I drove. It was still pitch dark without the streetlights, and I didn't know this area well, but I didn't care. I had to get away. Finally, I reached a part of town I knew. I raced to my home, bursting in the house almost before I'd shut off the car. My parents were watching TV, but I hurried to the phone and dialed the police before they could even ask me what I was doing. As soon as I connected with an operator, I told her everything I'd seen as fast as possible. She said they'd send some officers out right away, but they wouldn't be able to tell me what had happened. I never heard back from the police, but a few weeks later, I had to know. I drove to the cemetery in the daytime and climbed to the top of the hill. I found the remains of the giant bonfire, the ashes cold and gray. I stood there staring at them for a little while, then started to walk back to my car, but as I turned to go, I saw something out the corner of my eye. Slowly, I peered closer, and then I saw something that made my blood freeze. Hanging on the cemetery's wrought iron fence, perhaps 100 yards away, was a dress. A tattered white dress, stained red with blood.